It was the third week of March, and the temperature at the south rim of the Grand Canyon had dropped overnight to just below freezing. A 23-year-old geology student named Daniel Mercer had been registered for a backcountry permit, had checked in at the Bright Angel trailhead at 6:47 in the morning, and by 9 a.m. his hiking partner had returned to the rim alone. Rangers were notified. A search began. And then, for 5 years, Daniel Mercer simply did not exist. No body, no trail, no signal, until a maintenance crew, running routine checks on a sealed ventilation access point 300 feet below the canyon's north face, found a man sitting cross-legged in the dark, unresponsive to light and completely silent. His hair, brown in every photograph his family had ever taken, was entirely white. He was alive. He was breathing. And he has not said a single word since. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The Grand Canyon draws nearly 6 million visitors a year. It is one of the most monitored natural spaces in the United States, a place with ranger patrols, fixed trail cameras, radio repeaters, emergency beacons, and a decades-long protocol for search and rescue that is considered among the most competent in the national park system. People do go missing there. Hikers underestimate the terrain, the heat, the sheer scale of the landscape that looks manageable from the rim and becomes something else entirely once you are inside it. Those cases almost always resolve within days. Bodies are found. Accidents are understood. The canyon, for all its drama, is not a place where people vanish without explanation, which is part of why what happened to Daniel Mercer has never fully settled in the minds of the people who were there. Daniel was a third-year geology student at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. By every account, he was methodical, prepared, and serious about fieldwork. He had done backcountry trips before, not recklessly, but with the kind of careful planning that his professors noted as one of his better qualities. He kept handwritten checklists. He filed itineraries. He carried a paper map alongside his GPS because he didn't trust technology alone in terrain that could swallow a signal. His academic advisor, Dr. Patricia Hollis, would later describe him to investigators as someone who was, in her words, the last person she would have expected to need rescuing. That description, offered almost as a reassurance, would become one of the most quietly troubling things anyone said about this case. The trip that March had been planned for weeks. Daniel and his hiking partner, a fellow student named Kevin Adler, had obtained a backcountry permit for a 3-day route that would take them below the rim, do a section of the Tonto platform, and back up via the South Kaibab Trail. It was an ambitious route, but not an extreme one. Both men had done segments of it separately before. They had the gear. They had the food. They had filed their plans with the backcountry office and with their department. Everything was logged. Everything was known. The night before they left, Kevin would later say, Daniel had seemed fine. They'd eaten dinner at a diner near campus. Eggs, coffee, nothing memorable, and gone over their gear one more time. Daniel had been quiet, Kevin said, but not unusually so. He was always a little quiet before fieldwork. Focus, Kevin said. Just focused. They drove to the canyon before dawn and were at the trailhead before sunrise. The check-in log at Bright Angel confirms their arrival at 6:47 a.m. A ranger on duty that morning, whose name appears in the initial report, confirmed he had spoken briefly with both men. He described them as prepared and calm. That ranger's name and statement would later become a point of contention in ways nobody could have anticipated. They descended into the canyon together. Kevin would say they stayed on the trail for the first 2 hours without incident, moving at a steady pace, stopping once to check a geological formation Daniel had wanted to photograph for a paper he was writing. Then, somewhere around the Tapete sandstone layer, a descent of roughly 1.5 miles below the rim, Daniel said he wanted to take a short detour to look at a section of exposed rock he'd read about in a journal article. Kevin said he waited on the main trail. He waited, by his own estimate, about 20 minutes. Then he heard nothing, and Daniel did not come back. Kevin called out. He searched the immediate area. He waited another hour before making the decision to climb back to the rim. He would say later that he had expected Daniel to appear at any moment, that he had almost convinced himself Daniel had simply gone ahead on the trail. But Daniel had not gone ahead. He was not anywhere Kevin could reach. And when Kevin reached the ranger station, breathless and confused, the search that followed would be one of the most intensive in that district's recent history. Helicopters, dog teams, technical rescue units. Over the course of 11 days, rangers and search and rescue volunteers covered thousands of acres. They found Daniel's water bottle, about 400 meters off the main trail, resting upright on a flat rock as though it had been placed there deliberately. They found one of his boot prints in dried mud near a narrow drainage. They found nothing else. The initial explanation offered by park administration was straightforward. Daniel had likely suffered a medical event, a fall, a cardiac episode, possibly heat-related distress despite the cool temperatures, and it ended up in one of the canyon's many inaccessible drainages. The canyon contains hundreds of side canyons, slot corridors, and vertical features that are simply not accessible without technical climbing equipment. It was entirely possible, officials said, that Daniel was in terrain that could not be searched by conventional means. It was a sad explanation, but a logical one. The search was scaled back after 11 days, then suspended after 3 weeks. Daniel Mercer was listed as missing, presumed deceased. His parents, Robert and Carol Mercer Tempe, Arizona, were notified. His file was closed. Kevin Adler gave a statement twice, once informally, in the hours after the search began, once formally, in writing, 2 days later. Both statements were largely consistent. He had waited on the trail. Daniel had gone to look at the rock formation. Daniel had not returned. Kevin had searched, waited, and climbed out. That is what the formal record shows. What is less discussed is that Kevin gave a third account, not to investigators, but to a reporter named Susan Farley who was covering the story for a regional outdoor adventure publication. In that conversation, which was recorded and later posted online, Kevin mentioned something he had not included in either formal statement. He said that before Daniel walked off the trail, Daniel had told him something. Kevin described it as a comment about the canyon. He said Daniel had said, and Kevin was careful to note he wasn't sure of the exact words. Something like, "There's something down there that the surveys don't show." Kevin said he hadn't thought much of it at the time. He assumed Daniel was being dramatic about the geology. He didn't put it in his official statement because, he said, it didn't seem relevant. It had seemed like idle talk. That interview was posted. It was noticed. It generated some interest in online communities that follow missing persons cases. And then, about 3 months after it appeared, it was removed from the publication's website. Susan Farley later said she had been asked to take it down because it was causing distress to Daniel's family. Kevin Adler, when asked about it subsequently, said he stood by what he'd said but preferred not to discuss the case further. He has not spoken publicly about it since. At this point, investigators were left with 2 possibilities. Which one would you have believed? The first was simple. Daniel Mercer had an accident in remote terrain. His remains were in a place that couldn't be reached, and everything else, the comment about the surveys, the removed interview, Kevin's silence, was coincidence layered on grief. The second was harder to sit with, that something had happened in that canyon that neither the official record nor the people involved were fully describing. For 4 years, the case produced nothing. Robert and Carol Mercer hired a private investigator in the first year. He spent 6 weeks reviewing the search records and interviewing former rangers. He concluded that the official search had been competent and that there were no obvious gaps in protocol. He noted one thing in his final report that he described as unusual but not necessarily significant. The backcountry permit that Daniel had filed listed a slightly different route than the one Kevin described in his formal statement. Not dramatically different, but different enough that the search teams, initially deploying based on the permit route, may have been working from coordinates that didn't perfectly match where the 2 men had actually gone. The investigator noted this discrepancy. He could not explain it. Nobody has explained it since. The canyon does not stay static. Rock falls. Erosion opens new passages. Seasonal flooding moves debris. In the spring of the 5th year after Daniel's disappearance, the National Park Service contracted a maintenance crew to inspect infrastructure in a section of the canyon that had received very little visitor traffic, a stretch of north-facing wall, accessible primarily through a service corridor that had been in place since the 1980s, when certain geological monitoring equipment had been installed. The crew was checking ventilation access points, sealed metal housing set into the rock, used decades earlier to manage temperature and airflow in monitoring chambers below the surface. Most of them had not been opened in years. The third access point they checked that morning was different from the others. The exterior housing had been disturbed. The seal was not broken. It appeared intact, but the dust pattern around the frame was inconsistent with a fully sealed enclosure. One of the crew members noticed it and flagged it before opening. When they did open it, they found a narrow tunnel approximately 4 feet in diameter and 12 feet long, opening into a larger natural chamber beyond. And in that chamber, sitting with his back against the far wall, was a living man. He was thin. His clothing was deteriorated but recognizable as hiking gear. He was conscious. His eyes were open, tracking the light from the crew's headlamps. His hair was completely white. He had a beard that had grown well past his collarbone. And he did not speak. Not a word. Not a sound. He allowed himself to be helped out of the space. He offered no resistance. He appeared to understand that the men around him were trying to help him, but he said nothing. He was airlifted to a hospital in Flagstaff within the hour. He was malnourished, but not catastrophically so. He was dehydrated. He had old injuries. Heel fractures in 2 fingers on his left hand. Scarring on his lower legs consistent with repeated minor abrasions that had not been treated medically but had healed on their own. His core temperature was lower than normal, but he was not in hypothermia. He was, in the clinical language of the admitting physician's notes, alive and physically stable but neurologically and communicatively unresponsive in ways that did not correspond to any single identifiable diagnosis. He was identified through his fingerprints within 24 hours. It was Daniel Mercer. He was 28 years old. He had been missing for 5 years and 41 days. His parents were notified. They came to the hospital. His mother, Carol, would later say in a brief written statement released through their attorney that she had spoken to him, that she had told him he was safe, that she had held his hand. He had looked at her. She was certain he recognized her, but he said nothing. He had said nothing to anyone in the time since his discovery. No words. No gesture that could be translated into language. Neurologists who examined him found no structural damage to the regions of the brain associated with speech or language comprehension. His vocal cords were intact. There was no obvious medical reason for the silence. The chamber where he was found was examined by a small team shortly after his removal. It was a natural formation, not excavated, not constructed. The geological record of that section of canyon is complex. There are known cavern systems in the area, though most have never been fully mapped. What the team found inside the chamber was limited. A small pile of what appeared to be food remnants, seeds, dry plant material, the bones of small animals, a torn piece of fabric. No tools, no fire evidence, no written materials. Nothing that explained how a man had survived in that space for any portion of 5 years, let alone the full duration. The ventilation access point, when examined, was found to contain traces of biological material, hair and skin cells, consistent with regular use as an entry and exit point, which raised a question that the examining team noted in their report but did not pursue publicly. If Daniel had been using that access point, where had he been going? The Park Service issued a brief statement saying that Daniel had been found alive, that the circumstances were under review, and that out of respect for his medical privacy and his family's wishes, they would not be providing further comment at that time. That statement was released on a Thursday afternoon. By the following Monday, the case had generated national news coverage. By the following Wednesday, the Park Service had referred all inquiries to their communications office. Questions about the condition of the chamber, about Daniel's physical state, about what had sustained him, about whether any investigation into the circumstances of his survival was being conducted, all of those questions received the same response, that they were not in a position to comment. Kevin Adler, who by this point was working as a teacher in Tucson, released a short statement through a personal attorney saying that he was relieved Daniel had been found alive, that he wished him a full recovery, and that he had no further comment. He did not respond to interview requests. His attorney sent a letter to at least one journalist who had attempted to contact him directly, asking that Kevin not be approached again. The ranger who had checked Daniel and Kevin in at the trailhead on the morning of the disappearance, the one whose name and statement appeared in the original search report, could not be located for comment because he had left the Park Service approximately 8 months after the disappearance. His departure was described in internal records, obtained later through a records request, as voluntary resignation. He had given no public explanation. He has not worked for the Park Service since. An attempt to locate him through the addresses listed in those records were unsuccessful. There is a man, a former geological survey contractor, who had worked in that section of the canyon in the years before Daniel's disappearance, who agreed to speak to one of the journalists covering the story on the condition that his name not be used. He said that during his time working in that area, he had come across survey records, older ones, from the 70s and 80s, that reference a series of subsurface chambers in the north-facing wall section. He said those records had not been incorporated into the modern survey data he was given to work from. When he flagged this to his supervisor, he had been told that the older surveys were considered unreliable and that he should work from the current maps. He said he had accepted that explanation at the time. After Daniel's disappearance, he said he had gone back and looked at those older records again. He said they showed chambers in positions that corresponded with where Daniel had been found. He said he had contacted the Park Service to mention this. He said he had received no response. None of this proves anything. That has to be said plainly. A missing man, a sealed chamber, older surveys, a resigned ranger, a removed interview. These things can coexist without any of them being connected. People resign from jobs. Surveys are revised. Online content is taken down for reasons that are entirely mundane. The fact that something looks like a pattern does not mean it is one. And yet, Daniel Mercer is alive. He sat in a cave for 5 years, or for some portion of 5 years, in a section of canyon that no search team found, in a chamber that does not appear in current survey maps, and he survived. And he will not or cannot say a single word about it. Not about what he ate. Not about how he found the space. Not about whether he chose to be there. Not about what happened in the time between when Kevin watched him walk off the trail and when that maintenance crew opened a rusted metal door in a rock face and found him sitting in the dark. The medical explanations that have been offered for his silence range from severe dissociative disorder triggered by extreme trauma to a form of selective mutism with no clear organic cause, to possibilities that are more speculative and that the physicians involved have been careful not to put on the record. His hair went white. That is documented. It is a real phenomenon, known in medical literature, associated with extreme physiological stress. It does not happen overnight. Despite what popular culture sometimes suggests, it is a process, a gradual one, which means that whatever stress produced, it was sustained, not a single event, something prolonged. His weight at the time of discovery suggested that he had been eating consistently enough to remain alive, though not enough to be well-nourished. There were no signs of severe vitamin deficiency, which would be expected in someone living entirely without access to varied food sources in an underground environment. His body had been maintained, barely, but maintained, by something. The question that keeps returning, the one that none of the official statements have addressed, and that nobody close to the case seems willing to ask out loud, is not whether Daniel survived. He clearly did. The question is whether he was alone. That is not a conclusion. It is not an accusation. It is simply the question that the evidence, when you lay it out carefully and honestly, eventually produces. A man cannot eat seeds and dried plant material and small animals in a sealed underground chamber for 5 years and show no signs of scurvy, no cognitive impairment from malnutrition, and no severe dehydration damage to his organs. Something about that picture does not hold together. The medical team that examined him did not say this publicly, but one nurse who was present during his admission and who has spoken anonymously to at least 2 journalists said that the attending physicians were, in her words, confused. She said the word she heard more than once in that room was inconsistent. Inconsistent with 5 years of isolation. Inconsistent with the physical profile of someone who had been surviving alone in a cave. And she said, and this is a detail that has stayed with everyone who has reported on this story, that on his forearm, discovered during a physical examination, there was a series of small, precise markings, evenly spaced, clearly deliberate, not tattoos. The skin had not been punctured. They appear to be made with something that had stained the surface of the skin without breaking it. Nobody has said what they look like in detail. The medical record that contains a description of those markings is not among the documents that have been released in response to records requests. That specific page, the admitting physician's full body examination notes, has been withheld. The stated reason is medical privacy. That reason may be entirely legitimate. Daniel Mercer is currently in a residential care facility. His family has not disclosed which one. His parents have given no interviews since their initial brief statement. His academic advisor, Dr. Patricia Hollis, was reached by phone by one journalist and said only that she hoped Daniel would recover and that she had nothing further to add. The Park Service's review of the circumstances of his discovery is, according to their most recent public response, still ongoing. That response was issued 14 months ago. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. What we know is this. A young man walked off a trail in the Grand Canyon in March and was not found for 5 years. He was found alive in a sealed chamber that does not appear on current survey maps. He has not spoken since. His body presents medical inconsistencies that have not been publicly explained. A portion of his medical record has been withheld. The ranger who last saw him before he disappeared has vanished from public life. His hiking partner will not speak about it. And somewhere in a facility whose location is not public, Daniel Mercer is alive and silent, and by every account from the very limited number of people who have seen him, not obviously distressed, not rocking, not crying, not showing signs of acute trauma, simply quiet, as though whatever he knows, he has made a decision about it, or as though something has made a decision for him. We don't know which. We may never know. And that is not a comfortable place to sit, but it is the honest one. The canyon is 300 miles wide and a mile deep, and the survey maps that guide our understanding of it were written by people working from the surface, looking down. Whatever is in the spaces they didn't reach, whatever sustained a man for 5 years in the dark, whatever left those markings on his arm and took his voice and turned his hair the color of ash, it has not offered an explanation. And no one with the authority to pursue one seems to be asking anymore. That silence, in its own way, is the most unsettling part of this entire story. Not Daniel's. Theirs. If you've been following cases like this one, you know how often they reach this point, where the questions are clearest and the answers stop coming. Leave your thoughts below. What do you think happened in that canyon? And what do you think is still being left unsaid?